Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Our presentation today is on the theme of the journey to the cloud in banking and financial services, in which we're going to be looking at public cloud adoption within banking and financial services. I'm delighted to welcome back our presenter today, who's Ben Wooten, co-founder of Contino. They're a specialist consultancy which helps organisations adopt DevOps and continuous delivery. Ben's a fantastic presenter. He's delivered a number of presentations like this for us before. I think you'll find there's a lot of content, some really useful advice in here. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben.
Hello everyone, thanks very much for joining today. So as Alec mentioned, my name is Ben Wooten. I'm the co-founder of Contino. Little introduction about Contino. So essentially we help large enterprise organizations adopt DevOps and continuous delivery. That includes all of the people, process and technology elements of this transformation, anything which helps kind of large enterprises add speed, efficiency and agility to their software development pipelines. We've gained a lot of experience over the last few years in terms of how to set up your teams and how to change the operating model of your organization and how to adopt some of the tooling and platforms associated with DevOps, so your infrastructure automation tools, containers, and for many people it's cloud, so fundamentally changing their infrastructure to get more speed and agility into their IT organizations. So the aim for this webinar, first, I just wanted to do a brief introduction to cloud, just so we're all using the same terminology and just sort of revisit why cloud is important and valuable. We wanted to think a little bit about banking and their current challenges and why cloud is a good fit for the current challenges in banking, financial services and insurance. I wanted to think about the sort of typical cloud journey which we're seeing banking and financial services institutions going on from when they initially decide they want to use cloud through to a live and successful sort of production deployment and consumption. Along the way, I wanted to throw in lots of sort of tips for success and talk about some of the banana skins which we've seen with other organizations who have been looking to do cloud. And I wanted to wrap up by talking about how we as an organization support this cloud adoption journey. So firstly, what are some of the sort of key characteristics that we talk about when we mean cloud? For us, it's essentially any infrastructure which is provisioned on demand, either via a kind of user-friendly GUI portal or APIs. And when we say on demand, we mean literally provisioning new infrastructure in minutes or even in seconds. We want to be able to take that infrastructure and scale it up or down with sort of virtually no delay. So if we have spiky workloads, we can grab more infrastructure, and when the job's finished, we can wind it down. And the idea is that we kind of build flexibly based on that consumption. Typical kind of cloud nowadays will have both infrastructure and platform as a service features. So by infrastructure as a service, it means we can grab particular boxes with sort of raw operating systems on, or we can consume things like a database as a service or kind of higher level platforms as a service, so we're not managing infrastructure. Now, if you compare this with a kind of typical process within a bank or financial institution for getting infrastructure, you'll find that typically it's very slow in those environments. There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a long lead time, there's a lot of people involved in provisioning infrastructure, which is kind of the complete opposite of what the cloud aims to be. Now, one kind of early decision for organizations is whether to go down a private cloud route or a public cloud route. By public cloud, we're talking about things like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, and some offerings by big vendors such as your IBMs or HPs who offer sort of publicly available cloud infrastructure. The other option is private cloud offerings, so building something based on OpenStack or VMware vCloud Air, or go to some of those big vendors who can build a private cloud capability for us. Also, that comes into the cloud conversation is, this idea of consuming software as a service. So consuming Salesforce and Google Apps and services like Dropbox. They're all really part of the same conversation. Whether we're talking software as a service or infrastructure as a service, we're choosing to sort of put our trust in the hands of an external supplier and let them manage our infrastructure and our data for us. So there is a decision there, when the organization becomes comfortable with doing that. It's how do we, start to leverage these offerings? Do we want to sort of buy in infrastructure from a partner? Do we want to buy in sort of platforms as service features from a partner? Or do we want to buy in applications as a partner? So, we need to sort of get the right mix of infrastructure and offerings as we go about that. I called out the public cloud providers one because, that is the sort of main focus of this presentation today for organizations who want to move to sort of public infrastructure and platform as a service. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about is also relevant to your private cloud and your sort of software as a service applications. Now, we can see that cloud is beginning to sort of penetrate the sort of banking and financial services industries. In this diagram, we show by various classes of application how many people are sort of currently using public cloud infrastructure, how many people planning on using it, how many people are currently in evaluation, or how many sort of have no plan to use. And we can see it's, generally sort of half to 2/3 of people are currently in some cloud computing sort of adoption cycle. And, that's, to me, that's a pretty high number in the sort of traditionally conservative, financial services world, when we've got, 50 to 66% of organizations are on some public cloud adoption journey. And these figures are from about 18 months ago, so imagine it's becoming more aggressive all the time as the sort of use cases are being proven. Now, if we switch our attention into the banking industry and, their sort of current key challenges, in Q4 2016, on the one hand, they're very constrained. So, coming out of the financial crisis, there's a lot of focus on cost efficiency and how do we do more with less. They have these sort of very complex legacy technology environments, which we sort of need to change and modernize. There's a big sort of regulatory burden on your typical sort of FSI organization, and that's getting bigger and it's constantly changing, which is kind of impeding our ability to innovate. There's a big focus on security at the moment, kind of across all industries, but particularly in FSI. But against that kind of complex, constrained, restrictive backdrop, we're also kind of faced with demands in the banking world. The need to go faster, the need to have more agility, the need to sort of leverage technology to give customers sort of better digital experiences. Customers nowadays, they want to be using mobile apps, they want to be, online, they want to be sort of receiving personalized experiences. So there's a lot of pressure, a lot of demands on sort of banking technology to raise their game and deliver better applications and better software in spite of all of these constraints. And we essentially think that cloud computing, infrastructure, platform, software as a service is a huge enabler for sort of moving out from between this rock and a hard place. For instance, I talked at the start how cloud platforms and software as a service gives you this ability to kind of bring down what you need on demand and scale it up and down and adjust it, adjust the configuration of the infrastructure of those applications easily. So that allows us to be more agile and flexible and innovative as a business. The whole kind of cloud model can be much more cost effective. So, we don't need to purchase resources ahead of time. We kind of scale them up as we need and scale back down as we need. And cloud generally has a reduced cost of ownership. When you think about all of the sort of people and engineers who have to be involved in running your sort of current data centers, when we account for that in a proper TCO model, you'll find that the cloud can be a much sort of cheaper way of delivering infrastructure to your organization. And generally, sort of managing cloud platforms is much more efficient than how we did things traditionally. So your cloud platform will be sort of much more programmable. It will lean on automation and APIs to a much sort of greater degree than the old world, which removes manual activities and drives up quality. And this all contributes to, reducing the idea, reducing the time from idea to implementation. So it's actually, it's a huge enabler for doing things kind of better, faster, and cheaper, which, everybody always wants to do, but it's particularly relevant to banking at the current time. So now I wanted to kind of talk through, the kind of meat of the presentation really, which is what are the steps which, an organization needs to go through as they, move from their current sort of traditional way of working to a cloud-based delivery model. And here we've kind of outlined 10 steps which are, which kind of represent our framework for cloud transformation. Now, the first thing which an organization needs to go on is a kind of strategic acceptance that they want to kind of do cloud computing. The first part of that is just, kind of people at the senior level within the organization accepting the value which cloud can bring to their organization. If we want to sort of move towards cloud, it's going to be sort of challenging in many ways. There's going to be lots of hurdles to overcome, lots of changes to how you currently do things and your current operating model. So there has to be a real sort of senior level commitment to want to do this, and that only comes from, really understanding the value. There needs to be a recognition that, moving to the cloud is different than, just standing up a new data center or just installing a new application. Otherwise, we might sort of move to the cloud but fail to get any of the benefits from that. So the kind of top tip we advise people to do at this stage is to, engage with the cloud vendors and with experts who have sort of helped people on this journey to the cloud, who can help sort of educate the executives and the stakeholders as to, why it's important, what's a business case, what does a journey look like, and what are the challenges, and kind of get all of that sort of on the table and visible on day one. What we find is if you don't have this strategic sort of acceptance and desire to move to cloud computing, then you kind of hit rocks along the way because you don't have, the necessary executive support. So it's key to get buy-in at this early stage. And here we kind of show how, any migration is disruptive. We have challenges such as access to expertise. There's a lot of work which has to go into sort of security. There's a lot of work which has to go into, ensuring that your cloud solution which you build is compliant. So, this again is just to labour that point that, there are challenges along the way, and we have to get the organisation sort of sufficiently bought in and motivated to overcome those challenges. The next step, which a kind of bank generally tends to go on, is just looking at the business case. So, by now they might understand, how to sort of deploy and manage traditional data center or, virtualized infrastructure. But in a cloud world, it's a sort of completely different model, both in terms of initially procuring and setting it up, but then when you have a BAU run, because you move into a constant consumption-based model. So often, early on, there's a lot of work with finance to sort of model out what this would mean. So, what is the monthly cost? How does that compare to the total cost of running a traditional data center? And what does it mean? What does it mean as we move from sort of capex to opex? What we often find is that, sort of data center refreshes or equipment coming to an end of life is a common inflection point where you might want to sort of do this sort of analysis, and often that's when a move to the cloud becomes viable. This discussion around CapEx versus OpEx comes up a lot at this stage, and generally organisations like CapEx because you buy an asset and then you can depreciate that over time and write that off for accounting and tax benefits. But what we find when we look closer at the model is although we move to OpEx and there's some costs associated with that, because we can track demand much better, it often becomes a sort of preferable, it becomes a preferable model because, we never have overcapacity, we never have undercapacity, and we can change our infrastructure up and down in line with that demand. So, if you run the numbers carefully, we can sort of overcome this common objection. The next period, so, we've agreed we all want to, do a move to the cloud. We all think that the sort of financial case steps up, is then a period of risk analysis. So, for the first time, we're putting applications, we're putting data outside of the building. So at that point, we need to bring in, various experts to kind of risk manage all of this stuff. So, for the first time, we are moving, potentially moving data out of the country. So a common situation with British companies is, we're going to run in the sort of Dublin data center. So what we're doing there is moving applications and data outside of the UK. So we need to become comfortable with that, at least until these sort of London data centers come online later this year. We need to sort of be comfortable as an organisation that we are complying with all of the relevant regulations. And a lot of the kind of people who are driving cloud forward at the moment in banking are working quite closely with the banking regulators to ensure that they aren't breaking any laws in how they're using and consuming the cloud. There's a whole bunch of sort of risk analysis around information security. So how are we going to keep the cloud platform secure? How are we going to keep the application secure? How are we going to manage data security? And there's a big piece of the puzzle here is understanding where does the cloud provider's responsibility end and where does the organization's responsibility begin, because we operate on what we call a shared responsibility model. And then there's also a bunch of more sort of technical analysis around business continuity. So how reliable is the cloud infrastructure? Does it represent technical risk, and how do we overcome that? So there's a bunch of sort of architectural and technical work at this stage. What you'll find if you dig deeper into this is, your typical cloud provider has done a lot of this work for you. So here's the Amazon Web Service Assurance programs where they can show how their practices are compliant with, certain information security standards and SOC and kind of HIPAA for healthcare and various sort of country-specific regulatory regimes. So again, the tip here is to lean on your cloud provider and understand how they can accelerate your journey in terms of regulatory and compliance. So next, after we've got that sort of base level of comfort, organizations will often move to a kind of proof of concept stage. And here is a good time to do sort of vendor selection. And during this early part of the journey, you may pick one, two, three different cloud providers to evaluate against each other, because they are all sort of slightly different in what they offer and their view of the world. So we advise people to be relatively sort of focused here. So, don't try to do anything too big as part of this proof of concept and too visible, where lots of people are going to get involved and sort of slow down the proof of concept and distract you from what we're trying to prove. Another key part we'd call out here is, this first proof of concept is the time where we have to gain an initial network connection between, our organization's data centers and the cloud provider, because it's never normally appropriate to start exchanging information over the internet, even if it is a proof of concept. So there's often a lot of work here, in terms of setting up a virtual private network with your data center or something like Direct Connect, so we can start exchanging information with the cloud provider. One tip which you would say is, don't underestimate how complex it is. If it's the first time you're linking data centers with an external provider. We've seen many cloud transformations, which have, this part has taken a long while just in terms of getting the initial connectivity. But once we've got that, we can stand up some initial workloads, we can try, we can experiment and learn. And, at this point, we might not be using all of the best practices in terms of how that cloud's managed. that we will learn an awful amount by going through this proof of concept. So just a word on sort of vendor selection of the landscape. So what we can see here, this was a sort of recent Gartner Magic Quadrant released in August 2016, and it just calls out really the kind of huge leads which AWS and Microsoft have in the market in terms of what they've offered, their completeness of vision and their ability to execute. We have Google Cloud sort of coming up behind, and then lots of sort of I was going to say smaller vendors, but relatively big vendors, but still relatively niche when it comes to infrastructure as a service offerings. Here's a slide on market share. Again, it's from 2015, but it shows these sort of commanding lead of Amazon Web Services in terms of people who are running it, people who are trialing it, and people who have plans to put it into place. So again, sort of showing that AWS and Azure are sort of huge market leaders here. So next step, so imagine we've done a successful proof of concept, potentially a very long protracted phase of contract negotiation. And these are the sort of four areas we generally see as sticking points. So the first is pricing and commercials. So obviously sort of large enterprise, they're looking to sort of secure discounts, and maybe they're looking to consume it in a certain way. Maybe they can sort of pre-commit to certain consumptions, etc., and they want more assurance over how much their cloud platform is going to cost. So there's an awful lot of sort of back and forth on the commercials. The next one is around sort of service level agreements and quality of service. So if you imagine a bank or insurance company, they want to ensure that certain uptime is going to be provided to them. They want to know if something does go wrong, what is going to be the SLA to responding. There's going to be questions around the performance of the infrastructure which we're releasing. And then on the other side, the cloud provider will have acceptable use policies. They don't want people to be sort of going crazy and run loads which are sort of not appropriate for the cloud platform. So there'll be some negotiation over how are we allowed to use it, what represents standard use, and when are we sort of crossing the boundaries. And related to that, there's usually a lot of back and forth on indemnification. So this is what happens if the bank takes down the sort of cloud provider's data center, or what happens if the cloud provider goes down and impacts the business of the bank. So there has to be indemnification on both sides, and it's understanding what are the sort of financial limits there. There's then a period of, what are the, so we're looking ahead now to a sort of wider scale rollout. And there's then a period of the rules of engagement. So this is how are people within the organization allowed to use the cloud offering which we're going to give to them. And a big part of the puzzle here is all around data classification levels. So, as a bank, we're going to have some information which we're comfortable sharing with the public, so maybe a brochure or a website. Some is more confidential, and we might have different levels of confidentiality. And some information is restricted from a regulatory perspective, such as financial transactions or personal information. So there's often some kind of decision over what are we comfortable on putting in the cloud, in which circumstances. And that can be very sort of personal to a particular organization. And again, the sort of data sovereignty issue comes here a lot at the minute, because we don't, historically there haven't been data centers in England, so there's a lot of sort of debate about, we're putting this information outside of a country. What does that mean to our organization? And then there's more sort of technical rules of engagement. So, we might say you're only allowed to use a subset of the cloud provider services, or you're only allowed to use them in a certain way. So there has to be a sort of technical negotiation internally. What do our users need? What can we offer? How do we lock it down? And where do we sort of give our users flexibility? We then see, so we've done a POC, we've agreed how we're going to use the cloud at a slightly bigger scale. We then typically see early adopters come on. So different business units will start using the infrastructure as a service offering. And for us, our experience over the last few years is this is, characterized by a sort of lot of friction, because for the first time, we've got a cloud and we're trying to intersect with processes which were designed and which are currently in place for managing traditional data centers. So this is where that kind of senior level support really comes in, and that we have to sort of help the organization move to, a new way of working which is appropriate for the cloud. If they're not brought in here, then, the kind of senior execs are going to see that things are working in a completely different way. Maybe they're going to be worried that they're exposing the organization to some risk. And the cloud transformation can hit sort of real rocks in the road at this point. What we often find is here as well, we're going out to a broader user community. So we have to sort of support these teams with training and coaching and upskilling, and maybe putting cloud architects into those teams to help them use the cloud. But what's great here is, if we're successful, we can get some real sort of wins, and we can demonstrate, successful use of cloud for the organization. So it's a really key part. It's the first time that, we're taking something which we've probably built out of the central infrastructure of IT operations team, and we're kind of exposing that to the public. If that goes well, then that's good, and more and more people are going to want to use the cloud inside your org. If that goes badly, then the project can lose a lot of momentum. Next up, people go through a kind of what we call an industrialization phase. So that is what you often find, maybe it's a year in, and people are using the cloud, but they're all using it in different ways. And maybe people start getting worried about the cost. It kind of racks up. People don't think they're using it to too high a degree, but when you look across the organization, the total cost of ownership builds up. And there's a lot of reinventing the wheel, and people start to worry about governance, and maybe teams aren't doing things in the correct way. So what we have to do here is a period of industrialization where we try to come up with a template for success. This is how you deploy to the cloud, this is how you consume it, in order to do so in a sort of governed and secure and cost-effective way. So there's often a phase here of understand what does good look like from an industrialized perspective. How do we sort of remediate what other people are doing in the organization? And something that often strikes us is we could have kind of avoided this whole phase if we would have baked in, that kind of operating model and baked in those templates earlier on in the process, and avoided potentially sort of complex and expensive remediation exercise. So our tip here is, bring in that expertise early, and right from your proof of concept, you could probably design that in a really effective way, which is then, it goes out to the early adopters and sort of replicate the right way of doing things. Next up, getting to the end, is there's then a sort of period of, onboarding. So that is, we look around the applications in the organization, and we need to choose what do we put on the cloud. So you might find that your sort of, new greenfield digital systems are a sort of natural candidate to put in the cloud. But a typical bank are going to have, hundreds, if not thousands, of other applications dotted around their organization. And we need to make a decision over, what do we move over to the cloud? What do we lift and shift? What do we re-architect? What do we leave where it is? So at this time, there's a lot of sort of analysis at, looking at applications, looking at their architecture, looking at the sort of rate of change, and taking a view as to whether they're onboarded onto your cloud platform. And the final step is, this is a kind of continuous improvement step. And here what we find is, people they've deployed the cloud, we've got different groups for using it in a relatively sort of consistent and governed and secure way. But now we want to move to a sort of operating model and a way of working which is more appropriate, to sort of securing the speed, efficiency and agility benefits of the cloud. So, we work with lots of organizations who say, what does that operating model look like for teams who are working in the cloud? What skills do we need to make that a reality? What teams do we need? Where do responsibilities sit within that organization? What are the key processes of managing infrastructure and managing application deployments, and how do we sort of go on that change journey? And one tip we call out here is it's best to sort of get started and iterate and learn with your operating model, rather than get stuck in a analysis paralysis where you're trying to sort of dot every I and cross every T of how you work in the cloud. Just wanted to touch on that last point there around cloud operating models, because the most common problem that we see, and the most common mistake and pain point we see with our enterprise clients in the cloud, is how they essentially treat it like somebody else's data center and manage it in a very traditional way. So, organizations like that, although we've got this very flexible cloud platform, there's still a sort of lot of delay and a very bureaucratic process for procuring infrastructure from it. Maybe we account for it from a financial perspective in a traditional way. Maybe they want to put the sort of tools that they've always known and loved in a traditional data center into the cloud and find that they're not a good fit. So what we believe is that as well as adopting cloud infrastructure, you have to change how you work and change your operating model. And ideally, we think the target end state for that is what we call DevOps. So, DevOps is about sort of a closer integration between developers and IT operations, allow them to work in one sort of cross-functional team, and allow them to provision infrastructure directly from the cloud using sort of APIs or the GUI platform. We then want to give them a sort of fully automated pipeline for managing that infrastructure and managing their applications, and sort of defer responsibility and rights so they can work directly with infrastructure and move central IT out of the way as a bottleneck as it often is. Just touching on the kind of scope of that operating model, because a lot of people ask us, what are the considerations? What do we do? What changes as we move from traditional data center to cloud? And we think of a world like this. So at the first, there's kind of infrastructure focused changes. So at the bottom layer, it's how do I manage the infrastructure? So the sort of primitives of compute, storage, network, and data. That's going to change as we move to the cloud, because we're not managing physical assets and we're not managing virtual assets. So we're managing assets in the cloud. Then there's a set of sort of logical IT operations type processes which sit on top of that infrastructure, which is things like your environment management, patch management, network management, managing configurations and backups. So a bunch of IT operations infrastructure type concerns. Moving up the stack, you've then got application type concerns, and we split that into change and run. So your sort of change processes is, how do we deploy new code? How do we manage changes of kind of cloud-hosted applications? How do we evaluate the readiness of cloud, of applications which are in our traditional data center, and remediate and optimize them for to be hosted in the cloud? And what is that like support model and monitoring kind of model when our applications are live in the cloud? So at the bottom it's the infrastructure management tier, at the top it's the application management tier, and then there's a bunch of sort of cross-cutting considerations in your move to the cloud. So the first is, what does it mean for our people? So what are the sort of team structures and reporting lines and the skills which we need to consume cloud in an optimal way? What is the financial model? So how is it going to change how we account for our infrastructure and as we move from sort of CapEx to OpEx? And how do we control those costs and how do we optimize and reduce those costs? And the final one is the security model, which is the combination of sort of infrastructure type concerns, application level concerns. It intersects with the cloud provider shared responsibility model. So what we think we've done here is, covered all of the key considerations which an organization need to consider when they move from a traditional way of operating to a cloud-based operating model. So now I just want to touch on a couple of the sort of high-profile case studies which we like about sort of well-known banking institutions who are operating in the cloud. The first one is Tesco Bank. Now, these have called out how they really needed to innovate, they needed to go faster, they needed to be able to fail fast and try ideas and be more creative. And they've recognized that they need that underlying speed and agility in their infrastructure delivery. And there's a really good case study here of how Amazon Web Services, in this case, have helped them do that and helped them meet their ambitions. Second one is Capital One. Now, this one's interesting because the CIO of Capital One has recognized that their cloud provider, again, Amazon Web Services, can run a data center more securely than they could do so themselves. So they're a very sort of high-profile case study on AWS, and they've managed to shrink their data center footprint from 8 to 3 in just 4 years. And if you think about the sort of cost savings associated with that, it's very impressive. And at that link, there's another one around GE, who are a well-known brand who are consuming AWS. So, so in that section there, we talked about, what does that sort of cloud journey look like? What are some of the tips of success? What are some of the banana skins? And just covered a few case studies there of people who have successfully made that jump, very sort of large, well-known brands. So just wanted to spend a few minutes now sort of talking about our work and what we do as an organization to support these brands on their cloud journeys. Now, our approach to the cloud is it's very sort of DevOps-centric. So we think that it's a huge lost opportunity if you stand up a cloud provider and just treat it like somebody else's data center and manage it in a very traditional way. So we think that to be very successful with cloud, you have to sort of consider the people and process elements of that transformation as well and change how you work. From a similar perspective, we're often faced with that sort of architectural question of, do we lift and shift applications onto the cloud without changing them, or do we re-architect for making them more cloud native, more scalable, and to use all of the features offered by the cloud provider? And here our bias, again, we wouldn't do it for its own sake, but our bias is for re-architecture, where it helps you secure the benefits of cloud. Otherwise, kind of not really worth doing it if you're not changing how you work to get the speed, agility, efficiency benefits, and if you're not changing your applications to get the speed, agility, efficiency benefit, then the whole sort of business case question changes. It may still be worthwhile doing it, but the benefits are magnified if we make all of the full portfolio of changes. And what we find is that there is a big sort of upskilling challenge with organizations who want to adopt cloud computing. So weaved into our approach is a very sort of training and coaching based approach, where as well as helping the organization move to the cloud, we want to upskill their people so that they can take that forward after we've left. So we do a lot of work with organizations helping them develop their own cloud strategy. So that is understanding sorry, this is quite AWS specific, but it's understanding which cloud provider do we go with, what does the sort of what does the infrastructure architecture look like, how will we use that, etc., etc. We're doing a lot of sort of cloud operating model work at the moment. This is people who they have some sort of use of cloud infrastructure as a service, but now they want to go on that people and process change journey, so they can really get those benefits of cloud as we talked about. So we can help you achieve that. And then we're working quite a lot at the application level, so looking at portfolios of applications, looking, are they candidates for lift and shift or re-architecture? What should we move first to get the most bang for the buck? What do we leave where it is? We do a lot of work where we're categorizing applications into red, amber, green, or on a 10-point scale, and highlight the kind of risks and remediation points of moving those applications to the cloud. And then finally, it's what we call cloud-native application migration, which is picking up an application, moving it to the cloud, but then optimizing it for the cloud as well. So maybe breaking it up into different services or configuring it to use like platform as a service, features of the cloud platform. And again, doing this based on a DevOps delivery model where the full stack is automated and configured. So just a few of our quick case studies. So we've worked with one of the top 3 largest retailers in the UK, from their first connection to Amazon Web Services to a situation where they can stand up environments on demand with a click of a button. We've worked with one of the top 3 retail banks in the UK with a central IT group, and also the side of that, helping to rationalize the development tool chain and introduce more automation into that tool chain so they can do continuous delivery into the Amazon Web Services environment. And we're also working with one of the biggest telecom providers in the UK, which is essentially integrating with a cloud brokerage layer and configuration managing environments on demand. As well, with all of these organizations, helping them adopt DevOps and change how they work to consume the cloud in a sort of a modern operating model using all of the best practices. And at that point, I think that's the end. So have time for a few questions. So currently on the box on the right, if anyone has any questions, then please do enter them. We've had a few come in, but I'll give it a minute for other people to contribute. So there's a few people who have asked for further information on some of the graphics which we've used and some of the charts and facts. So I will send the slides around to the audience with further links and pointers to all of the sort of data we've used. If any of that wasn't clear. Someone said, is it a good idea to implement a private cloud? We've seen quite a few people who struggle with private clouds. They're pretty, it can be pretty sort of complex and a bigger project than people realise. I think the vendors often say, oh, it's pretty easy, you can be up and running quickly, and you need a relatively small team to deploy and manage it. So I think a few of our customers have been sort of disappointed at how big that project is. That said, if we do manage to successfully deploy private cloud, then it's a huge win in a way, and that you've got the sort of agility and efficiency and speed of cloud, but it's completely sort of behind the firewall in your control, and you would hope a lower sort of total cost of ownership. So you have to realise that it's not just about the sort of infrastructure; it's about the people that you need to manage that as well. So you need to be careful with that TCO analysis. what are the common problems and mistakes which we see? I think the main one we would call out is, yeah, it's just that, treating it like somebody else's data center. Just, I said that a few times, but I'd say that over and over again. Because what happens, we go through all of this trouble of, moving to the cloud and getting comfortable with the technology and the data sovereignty and all of that good stuff. But then we fail to sort of secure the speed and agility benefits. So, you've lost half of the benefits case for doing this if you don't change how you work. So, again, we just, hammer home that point that if you're going to do cloud, you have to change how you work and change the processes within your organization as well, in order to be successful. Somebody said, so are your services geared more towards large enterprises? I'd say yes. So we do help with some SMEs, but generally, if you're an SME, you can get started relatively quickly in the cloud. You can just go and enter your credit card and get started. If you're an SME financial organization, then you do have to be aware of you've got additional sort of uptime and additional regulatory concerns, so we can help in that environment. But it's obviously more complex in a big bank or financial institution with all of the sort of the legacy and the infrastructure complexity and the history and the fact that as I keep saying, you have to change how you work to consume the cloud. So this is generally a problem which large enterprise has. But yeah, we definitely have to speak with SMEs as well. And somebody said you only work with AWS, not Microsoft. That's not true actually. Sorry, the deck was slightly AWS focused there, but we are sort of cloud and infrastructure agnostic. So we'll help people implement any clouds. We have done work with Azure, and we've done work with most of the private cloud platforms. We see most sort of demand for AWS in the market, and as a business we've partnered with AWS to sort of help our large enterprise clients on that journey. So let's read them a question. Someone said that if you're going to use infrastructure for more than 3 years, perhaps it is advisable to buy it rather than rent it. I think it comes down to that full sort of TCO model where we, the sort of CapEx to OpEx model, and we have to look at the impacts of over-provisioning or under-provisioning, and then you have to look at the full TCO in that when you move to a cloud, you're also potentially saving lots of headcount in terms of people to manage your infrastructure. So, yeah, I think, the CapEx to OpEx thing, it's a little bit overblown when you look in a full, you look at a full TCO picture, and you really take into account the agility benefits of the cloud, and I think that's a relatively small component. So,
thank you very much.
I think I'll leave it there. So thank you very much. Thank you for everyone's time. We'll send the recording out later.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks everybody for joining. Just one final item to add. We did record the webinar, so if you'd like to watch it again or share with your colleagues, we'll be sending out a link in the next few days so that you can view it. So thank you, Ben, and thanks everybody for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you.